Today I am present to inform you that the Western world is facing a significant threat. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the Western world are co-opted by a world that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty and economic deprivation. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-intentioned desires to help others and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. The solution that collectivists will propose is not greater freedom, but greater regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we all become poorer and the lives of all of us depend on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. The conclusion is obvious. Far from being the cause of our problems, free market capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger, poverty, and destitution throughout the planet. I want to convey a message to all entrepreneurs present. Don't be intimidated by the political caste or the parasites who live off the state. Don't yield to a political class that only wants to prolong its power and preserve its privileges. You are social benefactors. You are heroes. You are the creators of the most extraordinary era of prosperity we have ever experienced. Don't let anyone say ambition is immoral. If you earn money, it's because you provide a superior product, better price, contributing to well-being. Do not yield to the advance of the state. The state is not the solution. The state is the problem itself. You are the true protagonists of this story, and know that from today, you have Argentina as an unconditional ally. Thank you very much, and long life freedom, damn it. Thanks.
We are currently at an inflection point right now in the world and in this nation as we're coming to a crossroad and it's time to make a decision. There have been many world leaders speaking out to the fact that we need to either change or die. The old systems are not working anymore, and many of them argue that actually socialism will be the great demise of the Western world, and that capitalism and libertarianism will actually free society.
Today I am present to inform you that the Western world is facing a significant threat. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the Western world are co-opted by a world that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty and economic deprivation. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-intentioned desires to help others and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world, but rather they are their cause. Trust me, there is no one better than us Argentines to provide testimony on these two issues. When we embraced freedom in 1860, in 35 years we became the world's first dominant power. 35 years we became the first world power. While when we embraced collectivism over the past 100 years, we saw how our citizens began to systematically themselves until they fell to the 100th position in the world, 40 in the world. But before we can have this discussion, it would be important for us to first look at the data that supports why free market capitalism is not only a possible system to end world poverty, but also the only morally desirable system to it. Now, not only did capitalism generate an explosion of wealth from the moment it was adopted as an economic system, but if one analyzes the data, what is observed is that growth has been accelerating throughout the entire period. In studying per capita GDP from 1800 to today, what is observed is that after the Industrial Revolution, global per capita GDP multiplied by more than 15 times, generating an explosion of wealth that lifted 90% of the world's population out of poverty. We must never forget that by the year 1800, about 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, while that number dropped to 5% by the year 2020, prior to the pandemic. The conclusion is obvious. Far from being the cause of our problems, free market capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger, poverty, and destitution throughout the planet. The left's doxa has attacked capitalism for its moral issues, for being, according to them, as its detractors say, unjust. They claim capitalism is bad because it's individualistic and collectivism is good because it's altruistic towards others. And thus they strive for social justice. But this concept that has become trendy in the developed world recently, in my country, it has been a constant in political discourse for over 80 years. The issue is that social justice is unfair and doesn't contribute to general well-being. On the contrary, it's an inherently unfair idea because it's violent. It's unfair because the state is financed through taxes, and taxes are collected coercively. Or can any of us confidently say that they pay taxes of their own free will? This implies that the state is funded through coercion, and that the higher the tax burden, the greater the coercion, leading to a reduction in freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the economy as a whole is a cake that can be distributed in a different way. But that cake is not given. It is wealth that is generated in what, for example, Israel Kirzner calls a market discovery process. If the good or service that a company offers is not desired, that company goes bankrupt unless it adapts to what the market is demanding. Create a high-quality product at a good price or attractive, succeed and produce more, so the market is a process of discovery where the capitalist finds the right direction on the go. But if the state punishes the capitalist for success and blocks him in this process, it destroys his incentives, and the consequences are that he will produce less and the cake will be smaller, generating harm to society. Collectivism, by inhibiting discovery and hindering appropriation, ties the entrepreneur's hands, preventing him from producing better goods and offering better services at a better price. Thanks to capitalism, the world is currently in its best moment. There has never been a moment in history with greater prosperity than the one we live in today. Today's world is freer, richer, more peaceful, and more prosperous than ever before. This is true for everyone, but particularly for those countries that are free, where they respect economic freedom and individual property rights. Because free countries are 12 times richer than repressed ones. Saying goes that in countries with freedom, people live better than 90% of population in repressed countries. It has 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. And if that weren't enough, citizens of free countries live 25% longer than citizens of repressed countries. But libertarianism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose fundamental institutions are private property, free markets without state intervention, free competition, division of labor, social cooperation, where one can only be successful by serving others with goods of better quality at a better price. In other words, the capitalist, the successful entrepreneur, is a social benefactor who contributes to the well-being of society as a whole. In short, a successful entrepreneur is a hero. I argue that the West is endangered, as in countries defending free market, private property, and other institutions of libertarianism, sectors of the political and economic establishment, due to errors in their theoretical framework and ambition for power, undermine libertarianism, opening doors to socialism, and potentially condemning us to poverty, misery, and stagnation. Because it should never be observed that socialism is always and everywhere impoverishing, failed in all countries where attempted. It was a failure economically, it was a failure socially, it was a failure culturally, and it also killed more than 100 million human beings. The main problem of the West today is that we not only have to confront those who, even after the fall of the wall and overwhelming evidence, continue to advocate for impoverishing socialism, but also our own leaders, thinkers, and academics who, sheltered in a misguided framework, undermine the foundations of the system that has given us the greatest wealth and prosperity in our history. The theoretical framework I am referring to is neoclassical economic theory, which designs an instrument unintentionally functional to the intrusion of the state, socialism, and the degradation of society. The solution that collectivists will propose is not greater freedom, but greater regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we all become poorer and the lives of all of us depend on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. Fortunately, more of us dare to raise our voices as we see that if we don't confront these ideas head-on, the only possible destiny is more state, more regulation, more socialism, more poverty, less freedom, and consequently, a worse quality of life. Unfortunately, the West has already started down this path. To many, it may sound ridiculous to suggest that the West has embraced socialism, but this view is only ridiculous if one limits themselves to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which states that it is an economic system where the state owns the means of production. Today, states don't need to control means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools such as monetary issuance, debt, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct alleged market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings. This is how we have reached the point where, with different names or forms, good parts of the politically accepted offers in most Western countries are generally collectivist variants. Whether they openly declare themselves as communists, fascists, Nazis, socialists, social democrats, national socialists, Christian democrats, Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. In the end, there are no substantive differences. Everyone argues that the state should control all aspects of individuals' lives. All define a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. We are here today to extend an invitation to the other Western countries to resume the path towards prosperity. Economic freedom, limited government, and unrestricted respect for private property are vital for economic growth. The impoverishment that collectivism produces is not a fantasy, nor is it fatalism. It is a reality that Argentinians have known very well for at least 100 years. Because we have already experienced it, we have already gone through this. Because as I said before, since we decided to abandon the model of freedom that had made us rich, we are trapped in a downward spiral where we are getting poorer every day. We have already experienced it ourselves, and we are here to warn you about what can happen if Western countries, who became rich with the model of freedom, continue on this path of servitude. The Argentine case is the empirical proof that regardless of wealth, natural resources, population capability, education level, or the amount of gold bars in the central bank's coffers, these factors do not guarantee success. If measures are adopted that hinder the free functioning of markets, free competition, free price systems, if trade is hindered, if private property is attacked, the only possible destination is poverty.
In the speech that broke the internet at the WEF, World Economic Forum in Davos, President Javier Milei spoke out to the fact that the West is in great danger and facing an existential threat, which will inevitably lead our world into poverty and destruction, arguing that capitalism is in fact the answer in libertarianism. Now, some of you watching might think this is actually a political statement, but actually, to draw on what Brock Pierce said, the co-founder of Tether, who also ran for president, he says that we are actually single-issue voters, and the cry heard round the world right now is freedom. So many world leaders are speaking up against what's happening right now in the world. The control exercised by what Bitcoin billionaire investor Tim Draper says are weak leaders grappling at anything they can to maintain that control. And it is in fact these weak leaders that are putting the entire world in jeopardy, because instead of letting things be free, instead of letting people be free, they're clawing to remain in power, to remain in control, and in doing so, enforcing even more stifling regulation and crushing innovation, and that something's got to give. We have all of these world leaders speaking out, and leaders like Charles Hoskinson, the founder of Cardano, who says that the cryptocurrency movement at its core is in fact not an economic one, it's one about freedom and liberty.
To me, I've always been a libertarian at heart. I say, just let people be free. Let people have rights. That's the original American invention. We wrote the Constitution, we had the Bill of Rights, and we thought that if people could have their own faith and people could have their own speech and the right to assemble and fundamental human rights, God-given rights, that we as a society would be better off. And that built the greatest nation in human history. And now we have a war for the identity of that nation, and there's people who have decided that we no longer have the right to have that. We should live in a dystopian society. And I think the cryptocurrency movement at its core is not an economic one. It's one about freedom and liberty. So I will say that from mountaintops. And what you see going on with Coinbase and all this stuff with the SEC, those are just tools to basically push us in that particular direction. And we have to stand up and say, no, we like to own our own identity, have our own economic agency, and be in control of our lives.
And then, of course, Tim Draper, who says that these weak leaders who try to maintain power and control, exercise regulation through enforcement, are actually stifling the economy. And when the economy has thrived the most has been when they have just let it rip, like back in the internet days under the Bill Clinton administration, and things were prospering and things were flourishing, all of them making one common argument in that capitalism and free markets are the way to the prosperous world, and what in fact has allowed the civilization to flourish. Now, let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree with this or not, whether you think this is the right path or not. And many are of the camp that actually the American empire will die if we don't change. Let me know in the comments what you think about this, but now I'm going to play for you some of these impacting clips with the goal of having you think outside the box, because we are at a pivotal crossroad in humanity right now. And the next 10 years, everything's going to change. Nothing will ever be the same. We just don't know what that change is going to be, but we are on the precipice of something great, of something different, of something better, perhaps. So Web3 is contributing greatly to that movement, and the ethos behind Web3 is freedom, liberty, and rights. The rights to sovereignty over your money, the rights to have a say in the way that things work, self-sovereignty. The fact is that the countries that have been the most free grow the fastest, and that control is the death to freedom. And Bitcoin is a threat to the way governments control their people. This is the roar of the dying lion, as Tim Draper puts it. And instead of fighting against it and enforcing regulations that cause the stifle of innovation, we should embrace this technology and let it rip, in the words of Tim Draper. I know this is a lot, but it is something to think about as we come to the most important crossroads together as a community in this fight for something better, for a better world, a more equitable world, a more accessible world, to democratize society as a whole. So if you like that, smash the thumbs up button. I'm your host, Megan Nilsson, aka Crypto Megan, and let's get right into this episode. As Charles Hoskinson puts it, we are on the precipice of an entirely new era, going from the governed to those who govern, and from don't be evil to can't be evil, in a whole new era of prosperity, transparency, and, you guessed it, freedom. That is the common denominator among all of these talks that I'm going to play for you now, and Charles Hoskinson is at the forefront of this movement. And then there's Elon Musk, who steps up to say, F you, Bob, if you want to try to control me with money, I'm not having it. I'm not standing for it. And then there's Yat Siu, the co-founder of Animoca Brands, who says that there's a fear of capitalism in the US from millennials who feel they've been left behind, but in fact, it's actually just due to a lack of financial literacy, and Web3 changes that, because Web3 allows you to be a stakeholder in this movement. It allows you to partake as an owner, as somebody who actually has power. Next up, we've got the infamous Elon Musk sequence, where he's standing up to Disney for getting upset that he didn't censor people. Check it out.
I hope they stop. You hope? Don't advertise.
You don't want them to advertise?
No.
What do you mean?
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go f*** yourself.
But
Go f*** yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob, if you're in the audience.
There's something liberating about someone of Elon Musk's influence and power standing up to the other powers that be, voicing his opinion, and not accepting to be threatened and controlled by money. Next up, we have a really powerful sequence by Yat Siu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, visionary investor in the Web3 space, who actually was part of the entire movement of the internet as it was born. As he describes why gamers are so anti-NFTs, he says it's actually mainly an American narrative, and it's because of the fear of capitalism, most likely due to lack of financial literacy. This is really powerful. Check it out.
The sort of implied revolution in blockchain and Web3 is the wider distribution of financial knowledge as a whole. And so if most people in the world, for instance, actually have the same kind of financial knowledge as we have with things like general information, like what we see on Wikipedia, for instance, the world would be very different. We would have completely different structures and a much more healthier ecosystem as a result of that. And the tragedy is that for most, certainly young Americans, their first experience with true financial systems is debt. And that's the problem, right? Because you basically get into some kind of long-term indentured servitude of a different type.
Okay, you said it right there.
Before you actually know how to get out of that.
Right.
And this also then creates all this sort of conflict that we see that's happening in places like the US. It's not just sort of you're being trained to be this worker bee. It's the fact that you are now stuck in a financial system, which you actually also don't understand. Because if you did understand it, nobody would sign up for 20% credit card interest.
Exactly. When I'm around the world at certain conferences and certain places, I see a lot of pushback from gamers about play to earn, about the play to earn model, and about being able to own their skins and in-game assets. And I find that to be unreal, because it's so clearly evident to me, and it seems like it would be a no-brainer for gamers. Why do you think that pushback is there from them?
So first, it is an entirely American narrative. If you go, for instance, to Asia, you don't just see people who sort of love sort of the idea of ownership and actually NFTs. Every major game company is thinking about an NFT Web3 strategy. From Square Enix to Krafton, the creators of PUBG, Nexon, Netmarble, I mean, Gumi, of course ourselves, right? Clearly, like almost every Asian game company has on their roadmap a Web3 NFT strategy, right? In contrast to the American ones. But that's not to say that the American game companies aren't thinking it. So it's not the studios themselves. Remember, back in 2021, EA and so on were like, NFTs, this is really interesting. And the community was like, no, we don't like that. And basically
it came from the community.
And they retreated.
Yeah.
I think it has a lot to do with a fear of capitalism that's happened, not specifically just in the crypto world, but something that's affecting America. Now, again, when I first came to America, it would have been unthinkable to me that there could be a socialist narrative. But today, socialism is a political platform, and it is a political platform, I would argue, for the Democratic Party for this matter. And I think there was a recent Pew study that showed that 60% of young Americans under the age of 30 preferred socialism to capitalism.
That is so interesting.
Now, why would that be the case? Well, if you take a look at the last 2 decades, capitalism hasn't worked for young Americans. They've been left behind. And the other thing is because they don't understand how money works, they don't have an understanding of financial systems. When someone makes a lot of money, something is wrong. It's this whole argument of billionaires are a fault in the system. The meritocratic system is basically doesn't really work anymore. They don't believe in this.
Right.
The thing that I often say lately is that the American dream is more alive and well outside of America than in America itself.
Wow.
Unless you're in Silicon Valley or in these places,
in these hot places,
or Miami for that matter.
Right.
But if you actually are in other places in America, it's desperate, right? Because the value of labor has basically declined in real money terms versus the value of capital. And if you didn't invest or don't know how to use your money, then you're behind. You are actually worse off today than perhaps even your parents' generation. And so when you think of it this way, then capitalism seems futile, right? Because the people who have money continue to advance. They can have the money to hire tutors. They can have the money to get to better colleges and so on. Whereas if I don't have money, I'm left behind. And that's so the pushback to me on NFTs and games isn't just about NFTs itself. It's basically a digital capitalism. The same people have problems with people at Wall Street. All these bankers that are making all this money. To them it's like dark magic.
Right.
Also, digital capitalism isn't helped by people who, make money on crypto and then they buy a Lamborghini or something, right? This thing, and they show it off. That sort of feedback is something that is, there's an aversion to it, right? You become allergic to it. And the fear is that you say, oh my goodness, does it mean, because I'm seeing a Bored Ape, that if I want to continue playing this game, I have to spend like $100,000, right? Then I become excluded from the one thing which still feels fair and equitable, as opposed to something that I can't, I would be left out. But of course, it's not true, right? It's not like every car in the world is a Lamborghini, right? You can buy a Volkswagen.
You have many options.
You have many options, but they don't understand that because, and they don't appreciate and understand also what ownership is and what it means. Because I think in places like America, ownership is taken for granted. You don't actually,
Absolutely,
you don't
100%.
actually understand the fact that you can own your house comes from the fact that you have this constitution and a democratic framework that protects what you have.
Right.
Whereas in Asia, most people in living memory still remember what it was like to own nothing.
Wow.
The economy in South Korea 40 years ago was smaller than that of North Korea.
That's crazy.
Because South Korea was a military dictatorship, for instance. Or look at China, for instance, right? And now all these places have embraced property rights, and they've become amongst the most wealthiest nations in the world. Increasing GDP because of the fact that you have ownership. And in living memory, you would know that. Right? Look at my own history in terms of my parents. They left the region for a reason, to look for better things. Whereas in America, you've enjoyed property rights really for hundreds of years effectively, and it was never under threat. This idea that you would buy a house and potentially could be taken away doesn't even enter your mind. And you, by the way, see this also very much with immigrant Chinese. Or immigrant Chinese are because they were persecuted and so on. They are in search for this kind of sort of safety.
Right.
And that's one of the jokes that we have amongst us is like, we're somewhat obsessed with real estate around the world, right? We keep looking at real estate prices and look at that stuff, even though even for just intellectual ideas in terms of pricing, because to us it's sort of a measure of safety as well, which happens with sort of persecuted societies.
Wow.
And by the way, I've seen this similar effect in Europe. When I grew up in Europe, we were not allowed to talk about money. That's why when I came to America in the 90s, talking about money was sort of the shock, right? It's like everyone openly talked about it and even looked up to it to say, hey, he succeeded. I could be there as well.
Exactly.
Which
it's
you
a sort of
do.
kind of motivating factor, right? I see that in Europe still, even Sweden, where my husband's from, it's a highly socialistic place, and people frown upon you talking about doing well or succeeding or having money, and that's a different narrative in the U.S. So I really think this is so interesting how maybe this all ties into that idea of being left behind and not understanding finances and the financial system, and that is what has kept people from truly succeeding, is that lack of education in that area as well, and understanding.
But I do think, and one of the things that excites us so much about Web3 is that I do think it can help solve some of that. And the reason why is because every participant in Web3 is no longer a consumer to be extracted from, which is the Web2 model. You become a stakeholder, which means, in effect, you own equity in the project you're participating in. You can even earn that equity. Right? So we think of data as a kind of labor. But the labor that you receive isn't money terms, because has been a betrayal in terms of the value of money for many reasons in the last decades.
Right.
But instead, you own equity. Now, imagine what the world would look like, that instead of your pension being paid to you in cash, that obviously has depreciated pretty badly,
right.
You receive a fractional ownership of property in the city that you live in. What would that look like if suddenly every pensioner actually owned real estate? As just one example of the effect of ownership. That's kind of what Web3 really is, right? When you participate, you end up becoming a stakeholder, an equity owner of the projects you're involved in. And therefore, not only contributing value, receiving back, but participating in the growth of its network effects, which you can't do in the traditional type of money concept. And so the younger generation, if they do this, because it is, after all, their more native world, they would actually build equity ownership in this construct, and therefore, have a way in which they can sort of get out of sort of the sort of malaise that they're in right now.
And the wheels that we've been talking about.
Exactly. But they don't understand it in America, partially because of this fear, the lack of financial literacy, and that's why they have this pushback on sort of NFTs, broadly speaking, because of digital capitalism.
Wow, what a powerful take from Yat Siu on why capitalism is actually a very liberating thing for society, but lately the narrative that we have in the US is one of socialism, but probably due to lack of financial literacy and also a broken system. And Web3 can fix that and democratize things and allow people to have the freedom to rise. What could be more powerful than that? And finally, a clip from Tim Draper from our podcast in Miami about weak leadership versus strong leadership and that desire for control that actually crushes society and the people.
I know you have a lot of theories about weak leaders versus strong leaders, and I also believe that is everything, right?
Yeah, my belief is that a weak leader is someone who tries to tell everybody what to do, and a strong leader is somebody who trusts people and sets them free.
Right.
And it makes a big difference. So we have a strong leader, finally.
Yes.
In Argentina.
And it makes everything right.
Oh, I'm proven out in a million different places where the countries that were the most free grew the fastest. It's just, and the ones that were socialist or heavily government controlled went flatline. Right. China is a perfect example. During their period where Deng Xiaoping said, I trust you, I set you free, and some of you will get rich first. That was a boom time for 40 years. It grew at 9% a year, and then President Xi came in and he said, none of this, none of this, none of this. You have to do this, you have to do that. And he's a very weak man, clearly.
Yeah.
And his economy went flatline. And he thinks that by doing that, he'll build a stronger country, stronger army, all that. Turns out that the countries with the least regulations and the freest economies grow the fastest and are the most secure.
Wow.
So it turns out that you don't want to flatline your economy if you are feeling like you want to, be militarily. Here's my theory. You want my theory on this?
Yeah, I do.
The internet came along and we were all open. And we were doing deals across borders. I had businesses in Russia and in China, great people I was working with in all sorts of countries.
Right.
Things were really booming everywhere. We were all benefiting from the trade that was going on, free trade going on around the world.
Right.
And then Bitcoin showed up.
Oh.
And it scared these leaders. They realized that they were no longer relevant.
At what point do you think, are you saying that happened?
I think as soon as they started talking to their central banks, and their central banks were saying, whoa, hey, we need to control our currency because that's how we control our people.
Right.
And control is the death of freedom.
Right.
So that's my theory, is that they started to put up barriers. Trump talked about a wall and then the trade war with China. President Xi decided he was going to, kind of increase his military and not trade around the world except buying ports. That's all he really wanted to do, was buy ports. President Putin wanted to invade Ukraine. That ruined the lives of 200 million people, and none of them really wanted a war except him. And weak leaders create wars because they're losing popularity. And then people kind of go, okay, well, let's get behind the country.
Right.
And that's kind of what they've done.
Rally.
So my theory is that Bitcoin came, it was a threat to the way governments control their people, and they freaked out. And so that's what's going on. And now I think it's the roar of the dying lion. I mean, nobody wants a centralized currency anymore. I mean, why? FTX was centralized, BlockFi centralized, Luna, Terra, they were all centralized. They all went belly up because it was all tied to one individual or one group.
Yep. People problems.
Weak countries have the same problem, where they have weak leaders. Historically, Argentina, Nigeria, Venezuela have horrible currencies, and they're all central control.
So there's one focal point or one common denominator.
And when people started to bring centralized currencies to me, I saw Bitcoin and I got all excited, and I bought all that Bitcoin in the U.S. Marshal's office auction. But I bought it all, and then I got deluged by people who wanted to create their own currencies, and they wanted to be centralized control, and I just threw them all out the door. We turned down FTX twice, we turned down BlockFi, we turned down Celsius, because they were all centrally controlled. And if you get, and the whole point of Bitcoin was that it was decentralized and open and transparent and global and all those great things. So we turned all those down, and we looked really stupid for a while, which is typical.
That's what happens when you've got that.
I'm willing to look stupid for a while.
Yeah.
And so then, of course, all of those went out of business. My whole thinking was, if you wanted centralized currency, you've got it. You've got a central bank. You don't need another currency.
Right.
But if you want a decentralized currency, one that is not subject to political whims, not subject to manipulation, or, Trump went and he spent $10 trillion. Well, if you print $10 trillion, your currency is going down.
Oh, yeah.
And that means inflation goes up and your interest rates have to go up because you have the Federal Reserve. They don't want a downward
Kicking
spiral.
the can down the line, yeah.
They didn't want a downward spiral like Argentina. And so they raise the interest rates, and then people get laid off. There's a horrible bear market.
Yeah, you kind
whatever.
of in essence break the economy for a while.
You've broken the economy for a while in order to let it come back. But you don't have to do that if you have a decentralized currency. Actually, Biden is doing something absolutely sneaky right now. What he's doing is he's blown through about 2/3 of our oil reserves in order to lower the inflation rate so he doesn't have to raise the interest rates. So he artificially keeps the economy going at a decent pace so that he can potentially get reelected. That's sneaky. That's sort of
underhanded. Not many people know about that. Not many people know about that.
It's pretty bad.
It's low. It's low. And just listening to
you got to let that free market flow, and then people adjust. And they, if oil goes up, you have to pay more for oil.
Right.
If oil goes down, you can expand your
let the market adjust.
business, and the market can adjust, and everybody's better off.
Yeah.
But if they start doing these little manipulating things, it proves to all of us that they are no longer relevant, and they need to reinvent government, and government needs to be something that is as a service, like software as a service, government as a service. Right. It should be something we choose and they provide.
And they actually try to provide a better service instead of more control, worse quality of life for everybody. Just listening to you now, it feels like all of this hardship and difficulties could have been solved so much easier with just a simple thing like Bitcoin. Who could have thought?
Amazing.
Or just freedom, it's very interesting to think all of these things that are happening around the world right now that are so unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the geographical borders being closed. Like when Bitcoin starts to get real adoption and it's, this digital portable property, soon the governments will have to fight for you, right? These geological borders or graphical borders, they won't mean anything because they'll have to come forward and say, hey, I'm going to provide a better service because I want you to stay here with me, right?
And you see the U.S. government being very paranoid and scared of everything. They're scared of Bitcoin. They're scared of AI. They're scared of all this stuff. Think of their age. They're like the average senator is 73.
Yeah.
And really, are they looking for how do we improve and think of the future and whatever? No,
Burning
they're
desire
looking
to
back.
go forward.
They're looking back and
Yeah.
they're going, no, I want dollars.
Yeah.
I want control over my people. I want everything controlled because, hey, I've made it this far. I want to just keep hanging in there. As opposed to somebody your age who might go in there and just go, hey, obviously we want Bitcoin as our national currency. Well, I want to be able to pay my taxes in Bitcoin. I want to go get my food, clothing, shelter in Bitcoin. No reason for a currency that is manipulated by a government.
No.
So that's it. These are just a few clips from powerful leaders around the world in their sectors speaking about the changes that need to be made. And capitalism doesn't always have to do with one side of the spectrum or another in the political sphere, but rather one of freedom and one of liberty and allowing people to rise, flourish, and succeed. Now, I wanted to play this for you because Javier Milei's speech broke the internet and because it's the cry heard around the world now as these world leaders are starting to step up against the government, against authoritarian governments who are grappling for that control. And many say that the pandemic was just the beginning to try to control people even more. Now, without going down the rabbit hole and getting into conspiracies, I just want to bring this to your attention as the power of the movement of Web3 is truly a sensational one. And, we have never had a better chance as a society to reestablish order in this world, a fair and balanced and equitable world, uplifting and uniting global citizens. So that's it for today. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you tomorrow.